Richard and Marla, thank you so very much for your two presentations already today. Our next speaker is Lexx Brown-James. Lexx is going to be speaking about de-pathologizing the Black Superwoman's kinky sexual fantasy.
I'm Dr. Lexx Brown-James, she, her, doctor pronouns. I'm coming to you from Lenape lands in Pennsylvania, specifically Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and I am featured in the wonderful book, thanks to Marla, seeking me out for my dissertation research on Black women, specifically looking at rape fantasy and power dynamics. And so I am a certified sexuality educator, certified sexuality educator supervisor, LMFT, so I get to wear both hats and it's a lot of fun for me. I'm also the current VP of membership at ASECT. You all won't do some of the activities here, so we'll skip through those. And the way that my research actually started, because it's really odd to the rape and fantasy together, for most folks, probably not the folks in this room, it sounds counterintuitive. And I was in grad school at Widener University and read an article that pissed me off. I was so angry reading this article that one of the discussions about this article looking at fantasy for folks, and it named out that Black women in their study did have rape fantasies, and they posited that it was potentially because Black women went through so many different sexual experiences that this was kind of the last frontier for sexual arousal. And I call bullshit. Bull. Absolute. What? And it's just more sexualized racism geared at and pathologizing Black women and Black bodies. And so I did a dissertation study to prove them wrong because I was angry. My actual purpose really was to establish a phenomenon, right? I wanted to see if this was actually a thing that Black women experienced. I wanted to see and not take some colonizer words for it in research. We know that research has typically been very white. It has typically been with white people, and it does pathologize Black bodies and melanated bodies. So that being said, there's a couple things you have to understand when we talk about the stereotypes of Black women and sexuality, right? There are three main archetypes, if you all don't know. There's the Mammy, the Jezebel, the Sapphire, and I posit there's a fourth archetype now. And so the Mammy is what used to be Aunt Jemima. I can't tell you what they renamed the company, but it was Aunt Jemima for a while. So the idea of the Mammy, the fat, dark-skinned Black woman who had kinky hair, wore a bandana, who was considered not sexual, who gave birth to the idea of the welfare mother, or even the earth mother. I think Erykah Badu, super earthy and burning sage and Palo Santo and all of those things. But typically looking at being asexual, despite the fact that they have a lot of children at times. And this is back when like enslavers would rape them and they would have children and then be capable and responsible for taking care of everybody's children, including their captures. The Jezebel, this is the Sir Mix-a-Lot Baby Got Back video vixen is where this evolved into. Originally this was Dorothy Dandridge, right? So the Coca-Cola shaped bottle, the 36, 24, 36 shaped sexy wonton Black woman who always wanted sex, was down for sex, Mrs. I'll steal your man type ideologies around here. Oftentimes also known as like the tragic mulatto, so had some type of mixture in the blood system. Also can come out of the Creole, so being from the South, like Louisiana, specifically the people de color, that idea. And then the Sapphire, so this is the neck popping, attitudinal, if you remember Amos and Andy, right? So that character who is considered the ball buster. Nowadays we look at them more like a Claire Huxtable, right? Or a Annalise Keating. So the kind of I demand you to give me sex, Oprah to Stedman, that type of ideology. And then the Superwoman, which is who I pose Black women have been contorted into being, now, but we rarely talk about the superwoman's sexuality and the effect of the sexuality. So with respectability politics, we know that Black bodies, despite whatever gender expression they have, tend to be sexualized from puberty. And so Black bodies can hit puberty as early as 8 years old. It's not abnormal for a person to start menstruation when they are a person of color 8, 9, 10 years old nowadays. It's no longer just 15 and 16-year-olds who are just now starting puberty. But once they are seen as having going through puberty, they're seen as adults and ready for sex. And so respectability politics come in of everybody's going to think you're a whore, so you have to act very presentable in order not to be considered a whore. And so the Black Superwoman is supposed to be able to do all things. So take a dime and stretch it into $1, take care of the community, take care of their family, take care of their children, take care of their parents, do well at work, be a Rhodes Scholar, as well as be a lady in the streets, but a freak in the sheets. And all of these have had like effects, right, on sexuality, and they all come with their own repercussions. So when we're talking about force fantasy, coerce fantasy, rape fantasy, I specifically fought to use the word rape fantasy in my work. As we know, with daily circles of sexuality, there is that sexualization category, but he tends to forget the consensual sexualization, right? And so rape fantasy is a consensual sexualization. It's a fantasy that happens in a person's head versus something that is happening outside of the world. So there's two types of rape fantasy, and that's aversive versus erotic. And so aversive is exactly what people think of when they think of rape. They think of somebody holding down, maybe super physical, super aggressive, and that tended to be not arousing for a lot of people in the studies that I had to audit for my dissertation. The thing that is arousing for people is erotic rape fantasy. And some of you might know this. Do you remember Skinamax? Right? So type a 1 in the chat if you remember Skinamax, when whatever that channel was, it would flip over from regular documentary to like the sexy saxophone music, right? And people having sex to it. And so Skinamax, you would see the person like, no, we can't have sex, as like she unbuttons her own blouse, and we can't do this, and she disrobes, right? Yes, having to watch it scrambled, absolutely. Mine was the Spice Channel. It was scrambled. You can only see parts of bodies, but that is what we're talking about when we're talking about erotic rape fantasy. And I was like, but why? Why would this be something that was really, really interesting if this phenomenon actually existed? So I had 3 research questions, and I wanted to know the prevalence, if this was even something amongst women. And when I say women, I include all women, despite whatever their sex assigned at birth was. 2, what's the relationship between that and their experience, and then their experience of sexual power, right? And I'll give you that definition in a second. And then 3, what other fantasies did they have? And I used 2 measures. It was a sexual fantasy checklist and a power sex measure. So here are some numbers, right? It was mostly straight Christian college-aged women. College-educated women, 26 to 30. The highest age in my study is 68, which I felt really, really honored to have. And I'll say that sex fantasy checklist is actually pretty long. It's about 80 questions in general. Lastly, these are the questions that were asked. So being overforced by a man or a woman to surrender, it's super binary because these studies were super binary at the time when they created them. And I wasn't creating a whole nother survey to ask. And the thing is, the power sex beliefs that we talked about is the belief that power is exchanged during any type of like sexual interaction, right? And that power is given away. And I was like, why would this be appealing to Black women specifically? And so in talking about that, I started to realize through the socio-historical-cultural model, which I created, of talking about sexuality throughout time for Black women specifically, and people who are associated in Black femmes, has been to accrue power. We've been taught to accrue power to be successful. We know statistically that Black women make 64 cents on the dollar, despite being the most educated population in the United States. We know statistically that for every degree that a white man has, a Black woman has to have 2 degrees in order to achieve the same level of notoriety and success. And so if you're taught to accrue power in order to thrive, then it's really going to be important to be able to lay that down. And to lay that down means to be able to not have to have that power dynamic so you can actually get to real pleasure. And the safest place to do that is in fantasy. And so that's what I wrote about in my chapter. I welcome questions or thoughts. And you can unpin me too. Thanks. Oh, I can do that. Haha. Back to a gallery view.
Can I ask a question, Dr. Lexx?
Of course.
So what I think I just heard you say is kind of at the completion, I want to make sure I'm hearing accurately, is that sense of, the psyche in fantasy often wanting balance. So if we're always having to accrue power, then the psyche can kind of eroticize what balances that. Now I want to be, dominated, or I want to be, raped, or I have a lot of friends that are pro-doms who work in Washington, and they say that they're most successful in Washington because of something similar. It's like the guys want to give up their power, and kneel and be flogged or whatever, and that there's that sense of balancing through the fantasy, balancing the psyche in a way through the fantasy itself. Is that what you're pointing to, or something else?
I don't know if I would call it actually balance here, right? I think there's a release and a reprieve in this ability to submit. And the safety. I think it's more safety than balance, specifically for Black women, right? And the idea that this is my only safe place in my psyche to relinquish power because no one's going to try and take it from me was something that came up in that power sex belief. So the people who actually experience rape fantasy, and I had 256, I think, people who qualified for the study. So the people who had rape fantasies, they believe that power was exchanged during sexual interactions. And so that is their safe place, and they can go to their fantasies to not have to hold on to power. So I don't know if it's so much as balance as far as safety. And I'd wonder if those pro-doms too would say that this is where this person feels safe not to make decisions and not to have to lead and not to have to own all of that. But thanks, great question. Sam said, I'm curious if the unjust pressure put on women, especially women of color, to prevent rape might also play a role in why some women might fantasize about rape as a fantasy of not having to be responsible or preventing rape. Sam, I'm not really sure. What I can say is, like, Nancy Friday's work often talks about women not being able to experience pleasure without being labeled as whores and without losing some of that respectability, right? And so specifically in the Black community, where women are often ranked as unwanted or not really attractive, it comes at the point where I can't be seen as a whore as well, because people already see me as a whore. And if I want sex, that's going to reinforce this idea that I'm open for rape, or people can take advantage of me, or that I can just be used instead of being something of value. So I'm not sure much of it is preventative, but rather this idea of I can't be seen as sexual because everybody already sees me as sexual, because colonizers on the coast of Africa got aroused when they saw bare-breasted African women on the coast and automatically assumed that African women wanted sex because they were aroused. And that arousal still gets put on us, specifically as early as puberty. 3 themes have emerged primarily in my work are the challenge, the abdication, and the desired. Thank you, Andrew.
I don't know if I need to add something to that. I was just going off of the themes that were being talked about. So I've done a lot of work in this area. I love what you had to say, because it certainly adds a whole other piece to what I've been doing for I think most people here are familiar with my work and the trainings I've done around this stuff. But the 3 pieces that I most often hear, and this is not by any means exclusive to these 3, but the idea of the fight, the challenge, and either overcoming or being overcome, the abdication, which is what Sam, I think, was speaking to earlier. The I don't have to worry about being a good girl if it's taken from me, that kind of thing. And then being the desired, they want me so much, they're going to break the law, or they're going to break the rules, they're going to overpower me. And then within all of those, there are themes of more force and less force. The gentle kind of coercion, manipulated seduction that they can't get out of versus physically being overpowered. And then you get into things like multiple assailants and gangbangs and all of that.
I think that's a great way to put it, Andrew. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. That's my time.